It's been years now, but that day still lives somewhere deep inside me. Some memories don't fade. They just rest quietly, like dust on an old photo frame. You don't touch them for years, and then one day, something small, maybe a sound, maybe a smell, brings it all back. Tonight, as I sit here in my room, the rain softly hitting the glass, I find myself remembering that day. The day my own son made me sit in the back of the truck, in the open air, while his mother-in-law rode with him in the front cabin. It sounds small, maybe even silly to someone else. But to a mother's heart, it was enough to break something inside. Not loudly, not with words, just quietly, like a flower crushed under a careless foot. I never thought I would see that kind of day. I raised him with all my heart. I carried him through every sickness, every fear, every night he woke crying. I was there when he took his first step, when he got his first job, when he brought home the woman he said he loved. I remember feeling proud, not because he was perfect, but because he was kind. He had that gentle nature that made people trust him. I used to tell my friends, my son, he'll never let his mother feel small. I believed that with all my soul. I live alone now. My husband passed away 5 years ago. It's just me and my little house in the suburb. Some evenings, I make myself a cup of tea and sit by the window, watching cars pass, families inside them, laughing together. Sometimes, I imagine my husband sitting beside me again, his voice teasing me about something small. But that day, that family trip, it changed how I saw everything. It started so normally. My son and his wife had planned a weekend getaway. They wanted to visit a hill station a few hours away. He called me a week before and said, "Mama, you should come too. It'll be fun. You need a break." I smiled. It had been so long since I'd gone anywhere with them. I was excited. Really excited. I even took out my old shawl and washed it, so it would smell fresh for the journey. I remember calling my neighbor that evening, telling her how happy I was. "He invited me himself," I said, almost like a little child. She laughed and said, "Of course he did. Sons never forget their mothers." I believed her. The morning of the trip, I woke up before sunrise. The city was still half asleep. The call for prayer had just finished. I made myself a quick cup of tea and stood by the window, waiting to hear the sound of the truck. It was my son's new vehicle. He'd just bought it a few months back. He was proud of it, always talking about how smooth it drove. When I heard the horn, my heart skipped a little. I picked up my small bag, checked twice that the stove was off, and locked the door behind me. The morning air was cool and fresh. The sky had that early golden color. When I stepped outside, I saw them already there, my son in the driver's seat, his wife beside him. And then I saw her, his mother-in-law, standing by the front door, talking cheerfully. I smiled and waved. She waved back, but her eyes didn't really look at me. She was dressed neatly, her perfume carried by the breeze. My son stepped out and came toward me. "Mama," he said warmly, hugging me. "You're ready early, as always." I laughed. "Of course, Beta." I didn't want to be late. Everything felt normal, until that moment. I looked at the truck, then at the seats. It had a front cabin that could fit 3 people easily. I thought I would sit beside my son, like I always used to when he was younger. But then he turned around, and with a smile, so casual, so unaware, he said, "Mama, you'll sit at the back, okay? We've got bags in the cabin." I blinked for a moment, thinking maybe I heard him wrong. "At the back?" I asked softly. He nodded. "Yes, it's open but comfortable. I've put a mat and pillow there for you." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Beta," I said gently. "There's space in the front, isn't there?" He glanced at his wife, then at her mother. His wife said quickly, "Mama gets motion sickness. She needs to sit in the front." My son smiled, half nervous, half polite, and said, "It's just for the ride, Mama. You'll be fine at the back." And just like that, the world around me went quiet. No one said anything more. They started loading the bags. His wife's mother walked to the front seat, smiling as she adjusted her shawl. I stood there, holding my small bag, trying to keep my face calm. I climbed into the back of the truck. The metal was cold under my hand. The open air brushed against my hair. I told myself it was okay, that I didn't mind. But inside, something broke a little. As the truck started to move, I held onto the side railing and looked at the city passing by. The wind was cold, and my eyes began to water. Not from sadness, not yet, but from the dust in the air. I could see their silhouettes in the front through the cabin glass. They were talking, laughing softly. Once, I even saw my son turn slightly toward his mother-in-law to hand her a bottle of water. It should have been me there. Not because I demanded respect, but because I had earned that seat with years of love. I thought of my husband. If he were alive, would this moment have happened? Would my son have dared to forget how it feels to honor the woman who raised him? The road grew rough as we left the city. The air turned colder. A small drizzle began, and I pulled my shawl over my head. Drops of water landed on my lap, soaking through the fabric. No one turned around. Not once. I told myself, "Don't cry." I whispered it like a prayer. "Don't cry. You're stronger than this." But a tear slipped down anyway. Later, when we stopped for tea at a roadside stall, my son came to me. He smiled as if everything was perfectly fine. "Mama, are you okay? You want something to eat?" I smiled back. "No, Beta. I'm fine." I said it softly, almost afraid my voice would betray me. His wife and her mother went inside the small tea shop. I sat quietly under the shade of a tree, watching people come and go. I could hear laughter from the shop, my son's laughter mixed with theirs. And at that moment I realized, sometimes heartbreak doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones who never meant to hurt you, but did. Just the same. That day was years ago. But even now when I think of it, my heart feels heavy. Not because of what happened, but because of what it meant. It was the day I saw that my place in his life had changed. The seat beside him was no longer mine. After that trip, something in me changed. I didn't talk about it to anyone. I didn't even bring it up with my son. But a quiet distance started to grow between us. Not something loud or angry, just silence. The kind of silence that builds slowly and fills every corner of your heart. When I came home that night, I unpacked my small bag, washed my shawl, and folded it neatly. Then I sat on my bed and stared at the empty tier across from me. It used to be my husband's tier. I thought of him again. He always said, "Respect, once cracked, can be glued, but the line will always show." I think that was the night I understood what he meant. In the days that followed, my son called me like he usually did. He talked about work, about how his wife's mother was helping with something at home. He sounded cheerful, and I answered like nothing had happened. I didn't want him to feel guilty. But sometimes, guilt is not what you want from your child. You just want awareness. You want them to see the small things that hurt you, without you having to spell them out. A week later, he came to visit. He brought his wife with him. I made tea and served it in the same old cups we had used since he was a boy. He looked around the room and said, "Mama, you should renovate this place. It's too old." I smiled. "Maybe one day." His wife laughed and said, "We'll help you. Mama knows a good decorator." I nodded politely, though my heart felt heavy again at that word. "Mama." Every time she said it, I felt a little smaller. I used to be the only one he called that. Now that word belonged to someone else too. They stayed for an hour or two, then left. After they were gone, I looked at the teacup still sitting on the table, half empty. The tea had turned cold. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the cups, and I wondered when the warmth had left. The tea, or my heart. I started noticing more things after that. When there were family gatherings, his wife's family always sat at the front of everything. The conversations, the plans, even the laughter. I didn't mind being quiet. I've always been a calm person. But I could feel the difference. How my voice had become something they could ignore without even realizing it. Once, during another family dinner, I tried to tell a story from when my son was little. I said, "Do you remember the time you fell from your bicycle and—" Before I could finish, his wife interrupted. "Oh, I've heard that one before," and laughed. The others joined in. My son smiled, but he didn't say anything. He didn't ask me to finish my sentence. I smiled too, but deep inside, a part of me folded itself into silence again. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something quieter. Disappointment, maybe. Like watching your favorite flower wilt. Not because it wasn't loved, but because no one remembered to water it. One evening, my neighbor came to visit. She's a kind woman, older than me. She brought some sweet rice and said, "You don't come out much these days." I laughed softly and said, "There's not much reason to." She looked at me, then said, "You used to talk about your son all the time. Now you hardly mention him." I smiled again, but it felt forced. How could I explain to her that love sometimes changes its language? That sometimes silence is the only way to keep dignity? Still, I missed him. No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't stop loving him. That's the strange thing about a mother's heart. It breaks, but it doesn't stop beating. It gets hurt, but it doesn't stop caring. So when his birthday came, I baked his favorite cake. The same chocolate one I used to make when he was a child. I wrapped it carefully and went to his house. His wife opened the door. She was polite, but surprised. "Oh, you didn't call first," she said. Trying to smile, I said, "I wanted it to be a surprise." Then she looked over her shoulder and said, "Mama's inside. She's helping me with lunch." Her tone was soft, but something in it made me feel like an outsider. When my son came out and saw me, he smiled. "Mama, you came!" He hugged me, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. Then his wife said, "Come, Mama, let's finish up before the guests arrive." And just like that, he turned to help them. I stood there holding the cake, feeling invisible in the house I once dreamed he would build for me. Later, when the guests came, mostly his wife's family, I sat quietly in the corner. They were all laughing and talking. Someone asked my son's mother-in-law, "How do you manage such a good son-in-law?" She smiled proudly. "He's like my own son." Everyone nodded and agreed, and my son smiled too. Not once did he look towards me. I left before the evening ended. I told them I had a headache. He walked me to the gate and said, "Mama, you didn't eat properly," I said. "It's fine, Beta. You enjoy your guests." He kissed my forehead and said, "Don't be upset." I smiled and replied, "I'm not." But when I reached home, I sat down on my bed and cried, quietly, like rain sliding down a window. The next few days were a blur. I went about my routines, morning tea, sweeping the floor, feeding the pigeons outside. But my heart stayed heavy. Every sound of a car on the street made me look out, thinking maybe he'd come, but he didn't. One day, I finally decided to visit him again. Not to complain, not to argue, just to see him. When I reached, the maid said they had gone out shopping with her mother. I smiled politely, turned around and walked back home. On the way, I saw a mother holding her son's hand, crossing the road. She was scolding him gently for running too fast. He laughed, and she pulled him closer. That sight made my eyes fill again. I whispered to myself, "Hold on to these years, dear woman. One day that same hand will forget to hold yours." After that day, I stopped visiting unannounced. I told myself, Let him come when he wants. Let him call when he can. And he did from time to time. Short calls. Quick questions. Mama, did you take your medicine? Yes, Beta. Do you need anything? No, Beta. That was all. The words were still there, but the warmth had left. Sometimes I replayed that trip in my mind, not because I wanted to stay in pain, but because I wanted to understand it. Why did it hurt so much? It wasn't just about the seat in the truck. It was about realizing that my presence had become an afterthought. I was part of the background now. Safe, loved in name, but no longer needed in the same way. And yet, despite all that, I couldn't bring myself to blame him. He wasn't cruel. He was just caught between worlds. Between his new family and his old one. Between being a son and being a husband. Maybe he thought I would always understand. Because mothers always do. And he was right. I did understand. But that understanding came with quiet tears and long nights of remembering who I used to be in his life. There were moments when I wanted to tell him everything. How that day made me feel. How small I felt sitting in the back. How I watched his reflection in the mirror and thought of all the times I carried him on my back when he was a child. But every time I thought of saying it, my voice would fail. How could I tell my own son that he had unknowingly pushed me out of the place I once belonged? So I kept it inside. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe silence, too, can build walls. One night I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting in that old chair again, looking at me with a soft smile. He said, "You always forgive too easily." I answered, "That's the only way I know how to love." When I woke up, there were tears on my pillow. That morning, I decided to stop holding the pain like a secret. Not to scold my son, but to make peace with my own heart. Because sometimes, forgiveness isn't about someone deserving it. It's about freeing yourself from what hurts. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. Weeks turned into months, and life went on, even when my heart didn't feel ready for it. I learned to fill my days with small things. Watering the plants, folding laundry, visiting the mosque nearby. People around me probably thought I had made peace with everything. And maybe, on the surface, I had. But some nights, I would wake up suddenly, my chest tight, the memory of that trip flashing in my mind again. It would come like a quiet ache. Not loud, just steady. I'd sit up, drink some water, and whisper a small prayer for patience. One evening, after one of those restless nights, I decided to call my son. It was late, but I just wanted to hear his voice. When he picked up, he sounded distracted. "Mama, I'm driving right now. Can I call you later?" I said, "It's fine, Beta. Drive safely." He said, "Okay," and hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time afterward. I didn't blame him, but I couldn't help feeling that there was a wall between us. Invisible but solid. A few days later, something happened. I fell in the kitchen. It wasn't serious, just a small slip, but I hurt my ankle badly enough that I couldn't walk for a few days. My neighbor came running when she heard me call out. She helped me sit down, bandaged my ankle, and asked, "Should I call your son?" I smiled weakly and said, No. He's busy," she frowned. "Busy or not, he should know." But I shook my head. I didn't want to be a burden. Mothers always worry about that. About becoming the weight their children have to carry. That night, when the pain was strong, I sat with my phone in my lap. I stared at his number, wondering if I should call. But before I could decide, the phone rang. It was him. "Mama, how are you? You sounded tired the other day." I smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Beta. Just a little hurt in my ankle." He paused. "Hurt? What happened?" I told him briefly, trying to sound calm. There was silence on the other end. Then his voice changed, softer, worried. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" "I'll come tomorrow." I said, "It's not serious, Beta. Don't trouble yourself. But he insisted. No, Mama, I'm coming. The next day, he came alone. When I opened the door, I saw the guilt on his face immediately. His eyes fell on my bandaged foot, and he said, Mama, you should have told me. I smiled. You have your own home, your own responsibilities. I didn't want to bother you. He didn't reply. He just helped me sit down and made tea himself, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. We sat quietly for a while, the sound of the boiling kettle filling the silence. Then he said softly, Mama, are you upset with me? I looked at him. His voice was low, uncertain, almost like a child again. Upset? Why would I be upset? I said. He hesitated. I don't know. I just feel like you've become distant. I smiled faintly. Maybe that's just age catching up with me. But inside my heart was racing. This was the moment I had wanted for so long. A chance to speak. And yet, I didn't know where to begin. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want him to see tears in my eyes. He looked at me again. Mama, tell me honestly, have I done something wrong? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then very quietly, I said, Do you remember that trip we took last year? The one to the hill station? He nodded. Yes, of course. Why? I took a deep breath. Do you remember where I sat? He looked confused. At the back, right? Yes, I said softly. At the back. In the open. He blinked, still not understanding. Mama, the front was full. You know that. I nodded. I know, Beta, I know. But still it hurt. He frowned slightly. Hurt? Mama, it was just for a few hours. You didn't say anything. I looked at my hands, folded tightly in my lap. That's because I didn't want to embarrass you in front of your family. I told myself it was fine. But that day, when I sat there watching you drive away with everyone laughing in the front, I felt like I didn't belong anymore. He was silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and still. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then quietly he said, Mama, I didn't mean it like that. I swear I didn't. I nodded. I know you didn't. You would never intentionally hurt me. But sometimes, unintentional things hurt even more, because they show what we've stopped seeing. He lowered his eyes. I could see his fingers trembling slightly on the edge of the cup. I'm sorry, he said softly. I didn't think. I just wanted everyone to be comfortable. I smiled sadly. Yes, Beta, you wanted everyone to be comfortable. Except you forgot that your mother's comfort doesn't lie in the seat or the air around her. It lies in feeling that her son still sees her. He looked up, eyes shining with unshed tears. Mama, please don't say that. I reached out and placed my hand on his. I'm not angry, Beta. I just needed to tell you how I felt. You're my son. No one can take that place. But that day, it felt like the world had shifted a little, and I didn't know where to stand anymore. He sat quietly, eyes lowered. Then, in a voice that sounded almost broken, he said, I'm sorry, Mama. I was foolish. I thought it didn't matter. I thought you'd understand. I smiled gently. Of course I understood. But understanding doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then slowly, he moved closer and held my hand. Mama, he whispered, I can never repay you for everything you've done. I didn't even realize I was making you feel small. Please forgive me. I looked at him, my grown son, who once held my finger to cross the street, now sitting before me, asking for forgiveness. I felt the tears rise, but I smiled through them. Beta, I said softly, you don't need to ask for forgiveness. You've already given me what I needed, to be heard. He stayed that night. He made dinner, helped me walk to bed, and before leaving my room, he said, I'll come more often. I nodded. I'll be here. That night, I didn't cry. For the first time in a long while, I felt something light inside me, like a heavy door had finally opened. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it lets the heart breathe again. and that night, I slept peacefully. The next morning I woke up early, made breakfast, and watched the sun rise over the roofs. The city was waking up slowly. I thought about how love changes, shape with time. How children grow up and build their own lives, and mothers learn to love from a distance. It's not rejection, it's just life moving forward. But sometimes, that movement hurts. Over the next few weeks, he did visit more often, sometimes with his wife, sometimes alone. He started asking, "Mama, do you need anything?" I would smile and say, "Just your time." He began calling me every evening, even if only for a few minutes. "Mama, how was your day?" he'd ask. And every time I'd feel warmth return to my chest. One day, when he came to pick me up for dinner at his house, he opened the truck door and said, "You sit in front." "Mama." I laughed and teased him. "You remembered?" He grinned. I'll never forget again. We both laughed. And in that small moment, everything that had once hurt began to heal. That night, when I sat beside him in the front seat, I felt a strange peace wash over me. Not because of the seat, but because of what it meant. It meant that he had seen me again. Really, seen me. At dinner, his wife and her mother were there too. I greeted them with kindness. The past no longer mattered. They talked, laughed, and I joined in. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like an outsider. Not because anything grand had changed, but because my heart had softened enough to let go. Later, when I was leaving, his wife's mother came to me and said, "You have a wonderful son." I smiled and said, "Yes, I do. And he has a good heart. He just needed a little reminder." When I came home that night, I looked around my quiet house and felt grateful. Grateful that life had given me a son who, though he made mistakes, had the courage to understand them. Grateful that I had found the strength to speak instead of staying silent forever. Because silence might look peaceful, but it often hides pain, and speaking, gently, honestly, can be the first step toward healing. That night, before going to bed, I looked at my husband's picture on the wall. I smiled at him and whispered, "He came back," in my heart. I could almost hear his voice saying, "I told you he would." From that day onward, something shifted between us. It wasn't the same as before. It was better in a quieter way. He treated me with more care, not out of guilt, but out of understanding, and I too learned to stop expecting love in grand gestures. I started to see it in the little things. A phone call, a shared meal, a seat beside him in the car. Sometimes, when we drove together, I'd look out the window and think about that day in the truck. The same memory that once made me cry now made me smile. Because it had led us here, to this moment of peace. Life doesn't always give us perfect love. Sometimes, it gives us imperfect love that teaches us patience, grace, and the art of forgiving without being asked. And I think that's the kind of love mothers are built for. That night when I came back home, I didn't talk to anyone. I went straight to my room, took off my shawl, and sat on the edge of the bed. The same bed where I had once held my son as a baby, where I had sung lullabies, where I had stayed awake during his fevers, where I had waited for him to return from school. Now I sat alone on it, old, tired, and quiet. I didn't cry right away. It was strange. I felt too empty to cry. Sometimes pain is so deep that even tears refuse to come. I kept thinking, what did I do wrong? I gave everything I had, all my love, all my years. And still, I became the person no one wanted to sit beside. The sound of cars outside my window reminded me of that day in the truck. Every honk, every gust of wind brought back that moment. Me sitting in the open, dust brushing my face, pretending it didn't hurt. Pretending it was okay that my son had forgotten I was his mother. I think a mother's heart learns to hide its pain better than anything else in this world. But hiding doesn't mean forgetting. The wound stays. It just grows quiet. For many days, I stayed silent. I didn't complain. I cooked when needed, cleaned what I could, and stayed mostly in my room. My daughter-in-law didn't notice much. She was busy with her own mother, who came to visit often after that trip. They would sit in the living room, laughing, sharing snacks, calling my son to join them, and I would hear their voices, like distant echoes from a place I no longer belonged. But time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest pain. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Life didn't stop just because my heart was broken. The sun still rose, the clock still ticked, and somehow, I kept going. One morning, I was watering the plants in the small balcony. It was early, and the light was gentle. I looked at the tiny green leaves and thought, even they don't stop growing after being cut. Why should I? It was such a simple thought, but it stayed with me. That day, I decided I would start doing small things for myself. I joined a small community class for older women in our neighborhood. We met twice a week to talk, paint, and share stories. At first, I was quiet, unsure of what to say, but slowly, I began to enjoy those hours. We laughed about small things, about forgetting where we kept our glasses, about grandkids' mischiefs, about growing old. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as a mother, not as a mother-in-law, but as a person. Back home, I didn't expect much from my son anymore. I had stopped waiting for him to change. But sometimes, God works quietly in the hearts we've given up on. One evening, I was making tea in the kitchen. My son came home early from work. He looked tired, but there was something different in his eyes. He stood there for a while, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, he asked softly, "Mama, can I sit with you?" My hands froze for a second. He hadn't asked that in years. I nodded and poured 2 cups of tea. We sat at the table. The silence between us was thick, like a wall neither of us could climb. Then, he sighed and said, "Mama, I've been thinking about that day. The trip." My heart stopped. He continued, "You didn't say a word that day, but your face, I can't forget it. You looked so small in the back of that truck." I tried to smile to make it easy for him. I said, "It's okay, Beta. It's in the past." But he shook his head. "No, Mama. It wasn't okay. I should have made you sit in front. You're my mother. I don't know what I was thinking." The words I had longed to hear finally came. But instead of joy, I felt tears rise. I didn't need him to say sorry. I just needed him to understand. And in that moment, I saw in his eyes that he truly did. We sat quietly for a while, sipping tea. Then he said something that touched me even deeper. He said, "Sometimes, I think I tried so hard to please everyone that I forgot the one person who never asked for anything." That line broke me, because it was true. Mothers often ask for nothing, and that's exactly why they're forgotten. After that evening, something changed between us. He started noticing me again. Small things at first. He'd call from work to ask if I had eaten. He'd bring me my favorite biscuits when he came home. Sometimes, he'd even sit with me and ask me to tell stories from when he was little. His wife, too, grew softer. Maybe she noticed the change in him. One day, she joined me in the kitchen and said, "Mama, I didn't realize that day hurt you so much. I'm sorry." I looked at her, surprised. Her voice was gentle, almost shy. I said, "You're young, Beta. You didn't mean to hurt me." She smiled and said, "Still, I'll make sure next time you sit with us in the cabin." I laughed, a small, real laugh that came from the heart. "Next time," I said. "We'll see." Life slowly became peaceful again. I didn't forget that pain, but it no longer controlled me. It became a lesson, a reminder that even love needs balance. Even a mother's heart must learn to rest, not only give. There were evenings when I still sat alone in my room, remembering that day. But now, those memories didn't sting as much. I could look at them like old photographs, faded, but still precious in their own way. Sometimes when my son dropped me to the market, he'd open the front door for me and say with a smile, "Front seat, Mama," and I'd smile back, pretending not to notice the small effort in that gesture. But deep inside, I did. It was his silent way of saying, "I remember, I learned." One Sunday afternoon, my granddaughter came running to my room. She jumped onto my lap and said, "Grandmama, Dad said you're his best friend." I laughed, hugging her tight. "Did he now?" She nodded proudly. "Yes, he said you always forgive everyone." That little voice filled my room with warmth. It was like God had used her small mouth to whisper a truth I needed to hear. That forgiveness is not weakness, it's strength. That evening I sat by the window watching the sunset. The sky was soft and golden. I closed my eyes and said quietly, "Thank you, God, for teaching me how to love without losing myself, because that's what it really was." I had spent my life giving time, giving care, giving my heart. But now, I had learned to give something else too. Forgiveness. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. In the months that followed, our family grew closer. My son's mother-in-law still visited, but this time, I didn't feel like an outsider. We shared tea, laughed together, even cooked side by side sometimes. It wasn't about comparing love anymore. It was about sharing space with grace. I realized something then. Sometimes people don't mean to hurt us. They just forget that we feel too. And when they remember, that's when healing begins. One night, as I was preparing for bed, my son came into my room again. He sat down quietly, holding a photo frame. It was an old picture. Me holding him as a baby. He smiled softly and said, "Mama, I want this photo in my office. It reminds me of who I should always be to you." My throat tightened. I said, "You'll always be my son, Beta. No matter what." He looked at me and said, "And you'll always be my home." That night, after he left, I finally cried. Not from pain this time, but from release. From knowing that love can bend, even break, but it can also mend again if we let it. I think back to that day in the truck sometimes. The open wind, the sound of laughter ahead of me, the sting in my heart. But now when I remember it, I also see how far we've come. That one moment of humiliation became a door, a hard, painful door. But behind it waited understanding, growth, and a quiet kind of love. And maybe that's what life is all about. Not perfect families or perfect moments, just broken people learning to love each other a little better every day. When I close my eyes at night now, I don't feel bitterness. I feel calm. I whisper a prayer for my son, for his wife, for their children, and I thank God for giving me the strength to forgive and the grace to keep loving anyway. Because love, real love, isn't about always sitting in the front seat. It's about staying in the journey, even when the wind is cold. It's about knowing that one day they'll look back, see you there, and understand what your silence meant. I smile when I think of that now. My heart, once heavy as a stone, feels light again. And as I drift into sleep, I tell myself softly, some pains come to teach us how to love without pride, how to forgive without forgetting, and how to be strong without shouting. It has been more than a year since that trip, the day my heart turned to stone for a while. Now, when I look back, it feels like a story that happened to another woman. But then, I see myself in the mirror, and I realize It was me. That quiet woman sitting in the back of a truck, holding onto the side rail so the wind wouldn't throw her shawl away. Sometimes, I wish I could go back to that moment. Not to change it, but to whisper something to my own self. I'd tell her, it's gonna be all right. You won't stay broken forever. Because truly, I didn't. I learned that hearts don't heal overnight. They heal slowly, quietly, in the middle of ordinary days, through little moments. A cup of tea made with care, a smile from someone who once ignored you, a small word of apology that feels like sunlight after rain. There's a kind of wisdom that only pain can teach. It doesn't come from books or advice. It comes from sitting alone in your room, looking at the wall, and realizing that love is not about being needed. It's about being remembered. I used to think being a mother meant always giving, always staying quiet, always putting others first, but I've learned that sometimes love also means stepping back and letting people see your absence. It means allowing them to understand the value of what they took for granted. My son understands that now, not because I scolded him, but because I stayed silent long enough for him to hear his own conscience. And that, I think, is the most powerful lesson of all. Silence can speak louder than anger ever could. These days, my mornings start peacefully. I make myself tea, open the curtains, and let the sunlight fill the room. Sometimes my granddaughter joins me, sitting on the floor and drawing pictures. She draws our whole family. Her father, her mother, her other grandmother, and me. And she always draws me with a big smile. Once, I asked her, "Why do I always look the happiest in your drawings?" She giggled and said, "Because you smile even when you're quiet." That made me think. Maybe that's my strength. I've learned to smile even through silence, to find peace even when life doesn't feel fair. Because carrying bitterness only makes the soul heavy, and I don't want to live heavy anymore. Every weekend, my son and his wife take me out for a drive. They never forget to open the front door for me now. Sometimes we go to the park, sometimes to the seaside. We sit together sharing roasted corn and old memories. I watch them laugh, their fingers intertwined, their little girl running around, and I realize this is what I always wanted. Not perfection, just love that remembers to be kind. A few months ago, my son bought a small new car. It's neat and shiny with a comfortable front seat. The day he brought it home, he called me outside. "Mama," he said proudly, "come sit in the front. You'll be the first one." I laughed and said, "It's okay. Let your wife sit." But he shook his head and said softly, "No, Mama. This time, you sit first." I sat down, feeling the cool leather under my hands. He started the engine, smiling at me through the rearview mirror. And in that small moment, I felt something inside me finally settle. Not pride, not victory, just peace. It was as if that single gesture raised the cold wind, the dust, the sting of humiliation from that day in the truck. All the pain that had once felt endless. It just faded, like a cloud moving away from the sun. I don't tell this story to complain. I tell it because I've realized how easy it is for love to forget itself. Children grow, lives change, and in the rush of daily things, even hearts that love deeply can lose sight of tenderness. But when love finds its way back, when it says, "I remember you," that's when true healing begins. Sometimes late at night I sit by my window and think about my own mother. I remember how, as a young girl, I would sometimes speak to her impatiently, without realizing how much she had done for me. Now that I'm old, I understand her silence better. Maybe all mothers carry that same quiet, a silence full of unspoken love. If I could talk to her now, I would tell her, "Mama, I understand you. I know what it feels like to give and wait and forgive." And I imagine she would smile at me, The same way I smile at my son now. Not with bitterness, but with gentle knowing. Life has slowed down for me, but in a good way. I no longer rush to be part of every moment. I just let moments come to me. The smell of cooking from the kitchen, the laughter of my granddaughter, the sound of my son's footsteps when he comes home. Each sound feels like a small gift. Sometimes I sit quietly and pray. Not for grand things, just for peace in my family's hearts. Because I've seen how easily pride can break love, and how easily love can heal it again. It only takes one soft word, one kind gesture, one moment of seeing someone's pain. One evening, my son sat beside me and said, "Mama, I'm teaching my daughter something." I asked, "What?" He smiled and said, "I told her that love means never letting someone sit alone when there's space beside you." I looked at him, and tears filled my eyes. He had learned the lesson I never spoke aloud. I reached out, touched his hand and said, "That's the right lesson, Beta." He nodded. "I learned it from you." That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was sad, but because my heart was so full. For years I had carried the weight of one painful day. But now I realized that day wasn't just a wound. It was a teacher. It taught me humility, patience, and the deep strength of a mother's love. As I grow older, I find beauty in small things. The sound of rain, the smell of clean clothes drying in the sun, the way my granddaughter's hand fits perfectly in mine. I no longer need grand apologies or big gestures. I've learned that real healing happens quietly, in everyday kindness. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that day again. The open back of the truck, the wind rushing by, my heart turning to stone. But now, that stone heart feels polished, smooth, warm. It doesn't hurt anymore. It just reminds me how strong I became. And I think that's the gift hidden in every heartbreak. It doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to shape you into someone softer, wiser, more understanding. If you ask me what I've learned, I'll say this. Love is not about who sits where. It's about who stays, even when things get hard. It's about remembering that one day, roles will change again. The child will care for the parent, and the circle will close with tenderness. When my time comes, I hope my son remembers me not for that day in the truck, but for the way I smiled after it. Because forgiveness is what kept our family whole. It's what turned pain into understanding. Sometimes I still talk to God about that day, not to ask why, but to say thank you. Because if that moment hadn't happened, maybe my son would never have learned empathy. Maybe I would never have learned peace. Every wound, I think, carries a hidden blessing. If only we wait long enough to see it. So now, when someone asks me how I stay so calm, I smile and say, because once I sat in the back of a truck and found my front seat in life. They laugh, thinking it's a joke. But I know the truth. That moment of pain became the path to my peace. And peace, I've learned, is the sweetest place a heart can rest. When I look at my family now, my son, his wife, my little granddaughter, I feel only gratitude. We are not perfect, but we are together. And that's enough. One evening, as the sun set and golden light filled the room, my son hugged me and whispered, "Mama, I hope I can give my daughter the kind of heart you gave me." I held him close and said, "Then love her softly, even when you're busy. Make her feel seen, even when she says nothing. That's all I ever wanted from you." He nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt complete. All the missing pieces, they finally fit. Now, I spend my nights writing small notes in a diary, not for anyone to read, just for me. Little thoughts, memories, and lessons I've learned along the way. Sometimes I write things like, kindness remembered is the echo of love. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's choosing peace over pain. Every mother deserves a seat in the front, if not in the car, then in the heart. When I finish writing, I close the book, whisper a small prayer, and turn off the light. And as I lie down, I feel the quiet warmth of peace. The kind that doesn't need words. Because in the end, it wasn't the truck ride that defined me. It was what I chose after it. To forgive, to love again, to let my heart stay open. And that, I think, is the real victory of love. Not the front seat, not the apology, but the stillness that comes when you know you have done your part with grace. If someone ever asks me what motherhood feels like, I'll tell them. It's like sitting in the back of a moving truck, sometimes cold, sometimes lonely, but still watching the road ahead with hope, because you know that one day, your child will look back and realize you were always there, holding on, quietly loving. And when that day comes, your heart, once heavy like a stone, will feel as light as the wind that once hurt you. That's when you'll know you've forgiven. That's when you'll know you've healed. And that is where my story ends. Not with pain, but with peace. The story we have told is fictional, but is based on some real events. The names and places have been changed to protect the identity of those involved. We're not sharing this to pass judgment, but in the hope that someone listens and pauses to think. How many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? I'm so curious. If you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose to stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you dare to face it all to get your voice back? I want to know what you think, because every story is a candle that can light the way for someone else. God always blesses.